Yeah, welcome to this video. This is Tim64, aka On the Stoop, and today we're going to look at two value bets and then contrast it with a bluff catch, all relevant bets being on the river. First game is a $100 six max, and as you can see, I've tried to obscure names for obvious reasons. This is a particularly unpleasant table. We're actually facing 5 regs, with the only recreational player on the table having already been knocked out. But that said, there are always weaker spots on the table, and we have to react accordingly. We have to try and play as many pots with the weaker players as we can. So in this hand, we're dealt King Jack on the cutoff, and it's folded to us, and we make a fairly standard 2.5x open. In terms of the players that we're facing who remain in the hand, then we have a sort of break-even reg on the button. The small blind is also around break-even, and the big blind is probably the weakest reg on the table. My guess is that he's losing slightly, or perhaps break-even after rake back, but not making much from the games, if anything. And the button and small blind both fold, and the reg in the big blind 3-bets us. And the sizing for the 3-bet is around 2.5x, just under. And when we look at his stats, we see that the 3-bet's 9.4%. Now that's after a sample of 500 hands, so we might conclude that in these positions he's 3-betting less than 9%, perhaps something more like 7.5%. So when it comes back onto us, we have King Jack. I think the standard play would just be to fold here, and I think if long term you called a lot of 3-bets with marginal hands like this, you're going to get yourself into trouble. But on the other hand, if you always fold, you become quite easy to play against, because you're really just continuing with a fairly narrow range, which you probably mostly be 4-betting. So I think once in a while it's okay to call, and you probably want to be calling mostly against the weaker players, who you'll have an easier time post flop. So we do go ahead and make a slightly light call, and we see the flop with 3 high cards, and we hit top pair with a gut shot to a straight. So our opponent makes a continuation bet of around half pot, and we call. I don't really think there's much else we can do here. Our opponent has 60 big blinds effective. We have a good stack ourselves, but raising here would really be just turning our hand into a bluff. We'd basically be representing a hand like 10 Jack, and I don't think that's going to be good long term. So we call on the flop, and I think if our opponent fires again a sizable bet on the turn, we're probably just going to have to give him credit for a hand like top or second set, or ace king, something like that, and just go ahead and fold. But we can see from his stats that aggression is somewhat low at 1.4, so I don't really expect him to be barreling off too light here. So we make a call and get a fairly dry turn, and our opponent checks. And we definitely could consider betting here, but really in this kind of situation there are not that many worse hands I expect my opponent to be able to call with. I think you could easily take a hand like ace king, and then, fearing I have a set of nines or a set of queens, check the turn to pot control. And I think a lot of the rest of this range is just going to check fold if we bet here. So I think checking behind is reasonable, notwithstanding that there are some draws. Okay, and we get a pretty blank river. The only hand that we're really behind now, once villain checks to us on the river, is 10 Jack, which I just don't think he'd play like this. I think he'd just go ahead and bet for value, even if he was slow playing on the turn. So the question is whether we can get called by a worse hand by betting. I think if we bet big here, we're going to force out most of his hands. But with a small bet, I think we can get some value. So We bet about 1/3 pot, just a little bit over 1/3 pot, expecting mostly to get folds here, but occasionally to get called by a hand like ace-queen. Ace-queen is kind of the hand that we're targeting here. And we do get looked up by villain, and we see that he shows pocket tens. So it's a kind of an interesting river call by him. I think the 3-bet's very standard, and in his shoes I would certainly bet the flop as well, but I think once you're called on this flop there really isn't anything that you beat, and I think on this sizing of river bet he really should assume that he's behind and not be paying off there. I think a better line from him would actually be a check shove on the river. I say better than calling. I'm not sure between that and folding which would be better. The reason being that he actually has 2 tens here, so he blocks a lot of the straight draws that I might be calling with on the flop. It's really hard for me to have a hand like you know, 9-10 say, that I might be calling and then turning into a bluff on the river. You know, again, you know, 10 jack obviously is hard for me to have. That would have been, I probably would have raised flop or at least bet turn. So I don't think really that there are many bluffs in my range when I choose this sizing on the river. So I think he just needs to find the fold there. And if you look at it in retrospect, I think the fact that we can get paid on the river here probably makes the call pre-flop a little bit more reasonable than it otherwise would be. Okay, so we'll just now move on to the next hand, and slightly different dynamic for this hand. We're 4-handed now. This is another, I think, $60 sit and go, 6 max. We've actually got 2 weaker players on this table. 28 hands on this player to my right, playing 29-7. Fairly weak looking stats, and then even weaker stats for this player to my left. 28 hands also, so just the hands from this particular game. VPIP of 43, pre-flop raise 25. Again, very sort of let's say fishy stats. So these are the 2 weaker players on the table who we want to be playing with. And then in the big blind is actually a reg. He's a decent reg, although he does have let's say quite laggy stats, and he does have a tendency to let's say overplay in spots or try to get into spots that, you know, maybe would be best avoided. So it's folded to us on the button, and we make a fairly standard 2x raise at this blind level with around 50 big blind effective stacks. The weaker player from the small blind folds, and we get called out of position by the reg. And we hit second pair, fairly dry board, and when checked to, we make a continuation bet of about half pot. And I think you definitely could check back this flop. The more you expect your opponent to check raise you light, the more incentive there might be to check back here. Although on this board, if we think villain would be check raising light, we could actually bet here just to induce the light check raise, because actually, I mean, you know, second pair top kicker is going to be very often the best hand here. So we get flatted on the flop, and I mean, I think villain can definitely have some semi-decent ace high hands that he'll float with for one street, hands like ace 9, ace 10, ace jack, that sort of thing. Ace jack's probably going to be 3-bet most of the time, with this player's 3-bet stats of around close to 12%. Obviously he can have some hands like king jack, king 10, king queen from time to time, and possibly some nut flush draw type hands. The turns are pretty dry card, so we can definitely consider value betting again, but against the reg, given that there are 2 fairly weak players on the table and we're in a fairly good situation, we probably want to be playing many more pots with the fish and not so many pots with the reg. So I don't really want to be betting into a king here and then, you know, having to decide what to do if my opponent leads the river. So I think checking back is reasonable. given that the turn is pretty dry and we're not afraid of too many river cards. Okay, so we check, our opponent checks and we check back, and we get to the river, which again is a pretty much of a blank. I think if our opponent leads here for around half pot, the hand he's representing is a king, and I think we'd have a pretty tough time. I think we'd have to call some of the time, but I think it wouldn't be straightforward. However, once he checks to us, we really know for certain that we have the best hand here. But the question is, what can we get called by? I think we can definitely get called by ace high. I think we could get called by hands like pocket sevens, pocket fives. So I think we have to bet here. And I'm betting on the smaller side, partly because, as I say, this player has a tendency to mess around post-flop. So I'm actually betting small here with the idea that he may check raise me with a hand like ace high, which he turns into a bluff, and then the intention is to call. So we bet just 100 here, giving him very good odds, and he does call, and we see at showdown that he has 3-4 suited. I think the only comments to make here is that I'm not really in love with his call pre-flop. I mean, it's really a clear fold pre-flop against a decent player when you're out of position. I think there's even more reasons why he should be folding here, and that's that he's just choosing to play against the better player on the table instead of folding here and waiting for a chance to play against the weaker players. So I think that's why I really dislike the pre-flop call. I mean, just from a sort of general standpoint, this is not to be advised. And then on the river, I really don't like the check call here. There's really nothing that I can be value betting that he beats. The only thing I can be betting there that he's ahead of is something like, you know, ace queen high, which would be a very thin value bet on my part, and then I'd have to be expecting him to be able to call off with hands like ace 10 or ace jack. So although he does have a pair here, I think really he needs to just find the fold on the river. I really shouldn't be bluffing for that kind of sizing when I'm obviously not expecting to get many folds from any kind of paired hands. So possibly I could have gone for a bit more value on the river the way the hand plays out, as a part of my bet sizing was having in mind that he might actually try and bluff raise me there with a weaker hand, and then the plan is to call off. Okay, and then let's just jump now to the final hand. Okay, so we'll just contrast those first two hands, which were value bets on the river, against what looked like capped ranges, i.e. ranges where we can be very sure that we're ahead of our opponent on the river, with this hand, which is a bluff catch. Now, the situation here is that we're on the bubble. This is a $60 six max sit and go. The player on the button, who we have about 250 hands on, is a reg. He's actually pretty tight, solid reg. The stats are filtered, so this is 29, 28 for a three-handed situation. And in the big blind we have a recreational player with, as you can see, much lesser stats. And we had a hand with him previously in this game where it was blind versus blind, and the flop was King 9x. I made a continuation bet. The turn was another king, and I checked. I don't recall what I had. I think I either had queen high or ace high. I checked, and my opponent very quickly bet, and I decided that a range of hands that bets very quickly on the turn is mostly going to be draws or air, because really if you've got a 9 or ace high, you're going to think quite carefully about whether or not betting's the best idea, and even if you've got trip kings, you're probably going to give it some thought as to how much value there is. So when he bet, I check raised him and he folded. So I got the impression from that he was betting somewhat sporadically, notwithstanding that his overall aggression factor is 0.4. And this is an interesting hand because it shows that aggression factor is one of these stats where you have to be a little bit careful in interpreting it. So the button folds, and we make a fairly standard steal from the small blind, just a little bit over half pot. We get called, and the flop is 6-2-8 with two spades. dryish flop. We make a continuation bet. I don't see much point checking here. We certainly can, but we don't really want to check call down 3 streets. So I think we start with a bet here, and we get called by our opponent. A turn is an interesting card, and in this situation, it really hits our range better than our opponent. So given that we had the hand that I mentioned earlier, I decided to go for a check here and see if I could get my opponent to bet light, and he does go ahead and bet around half pot. Our remaining stack at this point is about 1750. He definitely can have some queens in his range for check call, for calling the flop, hands like jack queen that he's pure floating with, so some of the time this will be for value. I think most of the time it can be some sort of weaker ace high hands, or perhaps a draw like 7-9, maybe a spade draw that he'd bet here. So we go for a check call here, and on the river it's a very interesting card. We have about 1,350 chips left, and it's a very polarizing card. We go for a check here in a situation really where our opponent should no longer be considering value betting any hand like 5-6 or 7-8. The only hands he should really be value betting are now 2 pair or better. Obviously if he's backdoored into a flush he can quite happily shove that. Possibly if he had a hand like king queen and he's rivered 2 pair, that would also be value bet. But looking at the 3 bet stat here, 27.3, I think we'd expect him to be 3 betting king queen at least a decent proportion of the time. So really I expect villain to be checking back a lot of his 1 pair hands here. So we go for the check, and the villain shoves for basically pot size, putting us all in. And it's a pretty ugly spot because it's the bubble, but if we just really break down his hands and think what would he really be value betting here for this size, given that I've checked called the turn and therefore my hand looks like either an 8 or a queen, it really looks like I'm kind of weak here, and he shouldn't be expecting to get that much value with with let's say a better queen. So this looks a lot like a bluff, and I think given perhaps that we've got the ace of hearts, which perhaps reduces the number of heart combinations that he might have bet on the turn as a semi-bluff, we go for a slightly thin bluff catch here, using the fact that we know our opponent's capable of betting when he doesn't have a hand, and we do see in fact that he does this with more or less pure rare on the flop, with just some backdoor spades and some backdoor straights. He turned a gut shot and bet, and then on the river realized that his hand was no good and bluffed off the pot size here. We made a nice bluff catch. So again, if you just contrast that with the first 2 hands and think about the bet sizing on the river, small bet sizing on the river usually indicates a hand that wants to get called, and it's usually a value range, whereas bigger bets are going to be much more polarized between either nut hands like say jack 9 of hearts here or something like that for our opponent, or really a pure air hand, because no kind of 6 or 8x hand will be betting this much on the river. So just contrast there between river bet sizes. Thanks very much indeed for watching, and be sure to check back here from time to time, and please do let me have any comments in the comment section about things you'd like to see in future episodes. This has been Tim64 aka On the Stoop, signing off.